Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 29th of November, whereas in Ukraine it is already the 30th of November. Today we're looking at really important updates, beginning with the flag being raised in Rosdolnia. Also, Velyka Novosilka, Andriivka, Krakow, Pokrovsk, as usual. Updates from those locations. We'll also discuss the battles raging in Terny and in Kursk. I want to zoom in, but before I do so, I also want to mention that by the end of the video, we're going to look at two new appointments made by Zelensky to the commander of the armed forces of Ukraine's ground forces and the deputy commander of their ground forces. So we're going to look at those two individuals who were just appointed and the implications it has, in addition to reporting from the Ukrainian side that they're going to do a structural shift in the Ukrainian army's organization. So it's going to be a shift towards a brigade corps system. That's what it's being described as, in contrast to what would be a divisional or tactical group sort of structure for an army. So we'll sort of try to break that down by the end of the video. First, I want to look at Rosdolny over here. You can see a geolocation from November 29th with a flag being raised by the Russian side, showing their capture of the village within the school in the center of Rosdolnia. So this was done by the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade and the 37th Motor Rifle Brigade. I have their icon over here, as they've also been involved in the operations east of Velyka Novosilka, but slightly less so than the 40th and also the 5th Tank Brigade. They've really been the spearhead for this charge. Not to look over here more generally at the fighting, we haven't seen reporting today of further Russian gains eastwards in the area between the Kashlach and Shaitanka rivers. And that's completely understandable because now the Russian forces are actually at the gates of the urban cluster. And at that point, it's much more difficult because the Ukrainian density in trenches to the east of the city is very, very minimal. There are some exceptions, and those exceptions were taken over by the Russians over the past couple of days. That's really been their focus, and they've been able to, in a very methodical process and relatively quickly, without suffering too much damage to their vehicles. Obviously, there was damage, but when you capture in such a fast amount of time, it really reduces the amount of vehicles over the long term that have to be damaged or destroyed during an overrunning or capture of a certain location. And so what this means is that now the Russians have control over the entirety of this eastern perimeter, meaning they have two very, very, very obvious entry points for armored vehicles from the 5th Brigade, for instance, to go in through. But first, there has to be preparation for it because the Ukrainians here in Velyka Novosilka, they've been present for ever since the beginning of the war, and it's been near the front line or somewhere pretty close to it within the range of like 10, 15 kilometers for the past 2 years. And so the Ukrainians have built it up as a defensive node. And every single house is, of course, a potential area where Ukrainian forces could be operating. They could be in the basements and so on. So, of course, you don't want to jump head first, even though the Russians have been able to yield such large gains to the east. So now there is artillery preparation, large scale airstrikes targeting various deployment points and potential Ukrainian infrastructure in this region, in addition to the supply routes, which the Russians are focusing on trying to cut off, which is really why they're trying to capture areas west of Rosdolnia in the first place. The fact that they even were able to capture Rosdolnia is a testament to the importance of the supply line leading into Velyka Novosilka, and the fact that the Russians understand that said importance. Now they're only about 700 meters away from the road that connects to the, Andriivka part of the front line, the various villages surrounding it, and the highway that branches out from that region that then branches southwards. That road is very, very critical as it is a large part of the defensive structure for the Ukrainians in this location. Now the Russians are very, very close within the range of small arms fire and potentially soon physically to cut it off, but they first need to overrun this local Ukrainian stronghold. And it really is emblematic of a broader problem for the Ukrainians here because you do have this one really well built stronghold. All the perimeter is in check, well built with all these different outlets and perhaps stealthy underground locations, command bunker positions for snipers, machine guns, etc. So the perfect, in isolation at least, sort of trench. But then the problem is it is in isolation. It's not connected to anything else. You have these various, anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, and wider trenches that are supposed to span several kilometers that were built in areas slightly to the west, slightly to the north of Velyka Novosilka and south of Kumar, I should say. And then they sort of fizzle out near Rosdolnia. And I just never really understood why the Ukrainians put so much of an emphasis directly north of Velyka Novosilka and not in an area to the east, in an area that definitely was exposed because the Ukrainians lacked the front line defenses in areas like Zolotaniva and Pokrovsk from the get go. That was known to every single local Ukrainian commander and every single higher up that there was just a lack of density in defenses here. That is an open area that could always be exposed to Russian attacks. I think it's because they put all their eggs into one basket in Vuhledar and assumed that nothing would really shift in a momentous way as long as the Ukrainians still held on to Vuhledar. And with the fall of it now, the Ukrainians really see that they can't put all their eggs into one basket, but it's too little too late. So the Russians took advantage of this large swath, hundreds of square kilometers, taken under their control ever since then. And that means that also the areas to the east of Velyka Novosilka suffer from a very, very similar fate, wherein they have a few localized strongholds that the Russians have focused on clearing out. You can see them over here on the map, but then they're not connected to anything, meaning that the Russians, once they finish with those certain locations, everything in between, all the hinterlands, they really become exposed and can no longer be used by the Ukrainians as defensive positions. So the Russians are able to maximize their gains even further. Looking a bit to the north, though, I want to see here this Russian advance 3.5 square kilometers just to the south of Andriivka. The Russians are now 6 kilometers away from Kostiantynopil. Really, really large update for them because that village is directly connected to Andriivka. It's the final sort of line of defense before Andriivka. And you could see that there is just a complete lack of defensive depth for the Ukrainians here. They have all these trenches to the north of Andriivka, which is, of course, important. But then to the south, it's just totally lacking. So then the only thing that really does serve as a buffer would be these two villages over here that the Russians are now close to reaching, and then the Vavch River, and perhaps you could say also the Sukhyali River, but both rivers are relatively narrow and would only be a small obstacle in the grand scheme of things. So the Russians are currently working on improving their local positions, getting control over as many open fields as possible in between Rozliv and the Sukhyali River Valley. Now the Russians are only, if we're going to measure it, about 3.5 kilometers away from the Sukhyali River itself, which again is threatening because then it would, cut off Sukhyali, Hihant, Kostantopolske, various other villages on the southern bank of this river, and also the Uspenivka pockets. So there is the opportunity for the Russians to harass the Ukrainian rear as they're currently engaged in very fierce frontline battles, and then also to just continue solidifying control over fields leading to Rozliv, and getting control of Rozliv would then give the Ukrainian, or the Russians, I should say, access to the wide array of fields over here, not fields, but roads that run through not just Andriivka, but the entire chain of villages located westwards, all the way to Komar, and then also to the Donetsk Dnipro border. So that's important to keep in mind going forward. But again, the main focus for the Russians does continue to be around Uspenivka pocket directly, not necessarily on the rear flanks. So here you can see near Trudove, a large-scale Russian assault leading to the capture of 2.7 square kilometers of territory. You could see here geolocation from the Ukrainian side from the 37th Marine Brigade. In the 2-minute long video, they show the first Russian column that advanced from south to north, just to the west of the Trudova ponds, being repelled. I think there were like 6 vehicles there, but it's hard to tell because of the thermal imaging. And then a second column comes in right as the first one begins to withdraw due to their understanding of the futility of the situation. Some of the first column was definitely destroyed during the artillery barrage. So the second one then comes in and does successfully reach its location. Also, I think has around 6 vehicles involved in it. Reaches the localized stronghold, and you could also see on the map over here in yellow, and then dismounted infantry. And infantry, of course, they were able to get out, storm the trenches, engage in small arms combat with the Ukrainian defenders, the Marines in the specific case. And at the same time, they endured from the air these grenades being dropped onto them by the Ukrainian side and FPV strikes. But all of that does confirm to us that there is actually Russian infantry located in this particular stronghold, which is already to the northwest of Trudova, which is important, and is also the final stronghold before this one that is at the entrance to Uspenivka. Following the fall of this specific defensive node, there would be nothing left between the Russians and taking over the settlement itself, or even reaching the Sukhyali River. So now you could see here a really massive bottleneck being formed, and the Ukrainian corridor between the Russian lines of contact and the Uspenivka pocket further and further being degraded. Now it's only 4.4 kilometers from north to south at its furthest extent. And Uspanivka is really coming in within the Russian purview as things go forward. But the 37th Marine Brigade, the fact that it's even operating over here is very important for the Ukrainians, because without that sort of proactive defensive ability to repel columns and sometimes conduct localized counterattacks, the Russians would have already been able to cut off Uspanivka and the pocket in its entirety. And you could say the same thing about a few other units over here that were recently moved in, that you can see on the map, like the 113th Territorial Defense Brigade from Kharkiv, 71st Jaeger Brigade came from the Pokrovsk direction. And that's critical to mention that the Ukrainians didn't just move units away from areas that are of low intensity fighting or were on the rear previously, but also from key parts of the front line, like Pokrovsk. And you could say that in the cost benefit analysis, the Ukrainians decided that it was worth it to move a high quality unit in relative terms away from a key sector like Pokrovsk, because there's an even more critical area that needs defending. But that does speak to the lack of sizable good reserve units that could be sent in to deal with these sort of defensive leaks, as we're seeing right now with the Usmanivka pockets. And so then the consequences, other areas like Pokrovsk get degraded in their defensive manpower and also just quality in general. To zoom in over here, there's also continued fighting in Zavetivka. The Russians have not taken it over in its entirety, but there are fierce clashes here. You have the 238th Artillery Brigade, Russian side, utilizing the 152 millimeter 2A36 Jason B, of course, howitzer to shell Ukrainian positions at the western edge of the village. So they had some sort of temporary deployment point over here spotted by the Russian side, and was targeted accordingly as the Russians prepared to now storm the remnants, the vestiges of the Ukrainian defense in that particular area. Here in Kurakova, you have additional reporting from the Ukrainian side, including Deep State Petrenko, of gains by the Russian side. This is already in the central section of the city. As we already know, the eastern portion is entirely under their control. And you've had over the past couple of days the movement of not necessarily just armored vehicles, but more so troops on foot across the floodplains over here. There's one really, or two actually, roads that are potentially being used by the Russians to move troops from the east to the center. So one would be along Belinskoho Road over here, and then around Zaporsky to the north. And this already reaches an elevator grain facility. So that region is partially under Russian control or in a gray zone, and there are a few other industrial sites that are adjacent to the reservoir that are currently very, very close to coming under Russian control, or where clashes could potentially end up occurring. The Russians themselves have been able to gain control over a lot of residential areas, including Usheskova Street. Here you have all the way to the west until Michurina Street. So these areas are now coming under Russian control, close to school number 5, the local high school. To the west, we still don't know about any sort of Russian expansion near the specifically Perimohi Road, because we do, of course, know about the infamous video from November 25th from the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade, one of the main units involved in the attacks here, which is, of course, a 51st Combined or 51st Army Corps unit. Again, remember DPR elements. So they landed in an apartment over here near the local store, near electronics store, library, a bunch of different massive important structures for the city itself that are within these massive concrete slabs. So the Russians getting control over them in such a fashion that really is far away from the front line. It is impressive. It means that they now have a foothold that can allow them to expand and blossom out without as much nitty-gritty fighting within each specific square block, within each in every single house in Kurakove. So now a lot of the positions, a lot of the houses that are directly to the east of this furthest Russian breakthrough will be more easy for the Russians to crack and solidify control over. Moving slightly northwards, you already do have a mapping of Bretsky showing full Russian control. It was captured by the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade. Now you have Ukrainian sources admitting the same thing, so I don't really have anything to change on the map, just an acknowledgement from the Ukrainian side. Here to the east of Zoria, you have Russian advances that include also captures of some of the houses and bushes in western Novodmitrivka. The Russians are now looking to capture Zoria. They've made an effort to really dislodge the Ukrainians from that village. In the process, they've been able to capture 1.5 square kilometers of territory. It is an important advance because the fall of Zoria, what that would entail is a further strengthening of the northern flank of Sontsivka, because right now the Russians are attacking Sontsivka, and the battles are have been raging now for several weeks. The Ukrainians, of course, sent in significant reinforcements and were aware of the material and personnel costs in doing so, but definitely were willing to pay the price in order to keep the Russians at bay in this location and prevent the further expansion that would isolate the Ukrainians located within this eastern flank or located southwards, either in Krakow or Andriivka itself. With that being said, you do have the Russians really attacking Sontsivka and entering it from a very narrow route, and so then expanding to the north would sort of alleviate any pressure that could potentially come from Sontsivka's northern flank for the Russian side. But additionally, getting control of Zoria would then give the Russians sort of open routes westwards all the way to the highway, this really important highway that is about, let's say, 8 kilometers away from where the Russians are currently stationed. And the highway, it runs between Andriivka and Pokrovsk. It is currently very stable in the sense that you do have a regular flow of manpower and equipment from north to south and vice versa. But there are two areas where it could be threatened. The first one is, of course, from Zoria to the west, but that is a bit far, pretty wide, and they would have to advance through a large swath of open fields. And then also around Zhovtova, we're going to get to in a second. It's only about 3 kilometers away from where the Russians are located over there. But again, the idea of severing the connection between the two largest cities of the Ukrainians have control over in their entirety along the front line, that would really be threatening for Ukraine's local cohesiveness and would really sever a connection, a massive connection between two parts that should be a part of the same front line, and sort of isolate them and then individually deal with them. So that would be the fear in potentially reaching the highway over here. More generally, allowing the Russians to capture Zoria would give them access to a vast array of open fields that would only be contested by Slovyanka and a few local defensive positions that really are not connected. Again, this is really a systemic issue that the Ukrainians have not been able to connect all of their trenches together and turn them into unified defense lines that would be formidable to overrun, even in a certain specific point that could potentially be overwhelmed. But now the Russians have so many different locations to choose from where they could overwhelm the Ukrainians, and the best possible area to do so would be from Zoria to the west. And what that would entail is just the Russians really taking up positions in the large array of open fields north of Andriivka. There's not enough Ukrainian depth in these areas when it comes to trenches or even manpower to push back against that sort of potential scenario. And that would be a massive loss for the northern flank of Andriivka that will allow the Russians to reach the trenches directly north of the town. And really, same could be said for every other village located along the same chain along the highway here, like Oleksivka, Zeleny, Krut, Novokranka, etc. Everything would be exposed from the north all the way up to the border with Donetsk and Dnipro, which is where, of course, the Russians would like to head to reach the border here and get control over Donetsk in its entirety and put further pressure onto the Ukrainian defenses that are being built right now between the oblasts themselves. So that's something that you definitely should keep an eye out for in the future. Also, here you have a slight Russian advance as they enter into Pushkina for the first time, trying to expel the Ukrainians from here with the same intention, the intention of reaching Novokranka and Novoolenivka, with the intention, as I said before, of cutting off the road between Pokrovsk and Kurakove. And this location, you have really only a distance of about 4.6 kilometers, so that is important to mention. And they're, in the sense, after Pushkina, and once you reach Novoolonivka, you have a chain of several villages that are connected nearby, but they are small in nature. They're really not well built for protracted defensive operations, and they could be bypassed and flanked from the south, in particular, in an area that would be just west of Zoria, for instance, or even from the north in an area that would be west of Zovtvet, where the Russians are currently advancing. But to the credit of the Ukrainians, at least they have a sort of unified defense line running. It's almost diagonally from the border with Dnipro all the way to Novoolenivka. But that's really not going to be enough to address direct head-on Russian assaults that are coming horizontally from the east, not necessarily coming from a vertical direction from the north or from the south. But in any case, I want to zoom in here in Zovtve and see what is going on as the Russians have captured 2.4 square kilometers of territory, including a large chunk of the village itself. This video, I don't know why it's untitled, but it's just indicating that there were Ukrainian strikes by the 150th Reconnaissance Strike Battalion onto individual Russian soldiers. I think they said there were like 8 Russian soldiers killed in the video, but They were walking along the bushy areas, the plantations in the village. And again, it is so small in nature that any sort of massive Russian investment into that attack over here that is coupled with proof of locations and like actual boots on the ground in most of the village, that's probably enough to say that all of it is under Russian control. But we're going to wait for further confirmation, because then it would put Pustinka in a really difficult situation where it would force the Ukrainians to completely withdraw from the gray zone located over there west of the pond and also west of the entire chain of tree lines and open fields over here, forcing the front line to sort of stabilize south of Novopustinka. What this means is that the Russians have been able to develop an axis of attack that is very, very effective, all the way from Hurivka to Petrivka and that's Zovte, that runs along a rail line that could then reach the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk. And the first real test for this operation for this entire axis along the rail line would be Shevchenko, because that's a village that actually is prepared with some defenses and is located along the perimeter ring, the third to last defensive perimeter of Pokrovsk and Munirhad. And it's a larger settlement than some of the ones that the Russians have currently been hopping through. It's an area where the Ukrainians definitely have had the ability to organize a defense, and it's going to be interesting to see how they're able to hold up against sustained Russian pressure. Here, this is from November 29th, but it may be earlier. It's just a video of the 117th Heavy Mechanized Brigade with their tankers firing onto Russian positions in Petrivka. So this is important because it indicates to us that the 117th Brigade is actually operating here and that they are not, on the rear, because we didn't hear much from them recently, but they're definitely involved now. So they have at least 2 tank battalions, I believe, based on their status as a heavy mechanized brigade. And they also have the infantry units that are involved with the defense, trying to just beef up the Ukrainian positions over here, in addition to the 68th Brigade and 25th Air Assault Brigade that is also active in this region. And speaking of 25th Brigade, they released footage here of just grenade drops and FPV strikes onto Russian infantry located south of Lysivka. And this would be in the area near the cemetery and the agricultural warehouse. So this is a part of a new flanking operation from the south that the Russians are conducting in order to overrun the Ukrainian defensive holdings here, because they were able to hold out against direct Russian attacks coming in from the east. So now the focus is shifting to attacking them from the south directly. Now, to look at Terny, we're going to zoom in here. You'll see that footage released by the 60th and 67th Mechanized Brigades have indicated slight Russian advances, but the pace here is slow because the Ukrainians do have a strong, compact defense within a very narrow corridor for advance for Russian armored vehicles. And again, it's also not necessarily the highest Russian priority. So they're not going to dedicate as much resources, whether it be munitions or just air sorties, to assist with the operation, even though it is still going on. And there's an accumulation of armored vehicles that is expected to really climax over the next 2 weeks as the Russians plan to take it over during that time frame. Here you have 2.2 square kilometers in total taken over by the Russian side. And the Russian advances are largely coming in from the east to the west into the actual Zharbets River region. So the Russians do tend to advance along the Kruglaya Gully. You could see that marked over here in red for you guys. Most of it now has been taken over by the Russian side, including the tree lines and the lowest elevated points. And as a result, they also have access to this road over here, this road that is sort of advancing northwestwards into Terny itself. So that's a new potential axis through which the Russians could enter in and dismount troops in Terny. Because from usually what we're seeing are the Russian soldiers not reaching the village itself, but then having to be forced to get dismounted in the gully itself, and then from there try to advance westwards into agricultural warehouses, for instance, or being picked off by the Ukrainian drones themselves, which has become a really huge problem as the Ukrainian drone activity in this region really substantial. This video from November 28th is an indication of that, showing the location, the forward Russian position with troops being targeted and agricultural buildings, which is enough to show to us that the Russians actually are in present in the southern part of Terny, which is important to note. But at the same time, you also have the defensive efforts of the Ukrainian units over here. So just as an example, you had on the 27th of November, 60th and 67th Brigade damaging 2 BTR 82As and destroying 3 BMPs. And there's a few other examples from recent days of several tanks. I believe it could be upwards of 4 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed during combat operations around Terny as the vehicles advance westwards or eastwards. Yeah, from the east to the west, they get spotted by the aerial reconnaissance and struck. and there's not much they can do out in the open over there. They're forced to be abandoned, and then the troops, they get usually picked off, and this is all posted by the Ukrainian side in this Terny region. But nevertheless, the Russians do still have the ability to advance over here and have been able to, seize marginal gains, all with the plan of finally expelling the Russians or Ukrainians from the eastern bank of the Zherovets River, and doing so along a relatively narrow corridor. Now I want to look at the Kursk region. There is an important update as the Russian forces have been able to advance just south of the pond over here, the pond and the river that would be called the Snagost River, into Darino. We've known about this now for like 2.5 weeks. But the Russians just to the northeast have also been able to advance specifically along this Verdlikovo highway. So in total, they took over 7.6 square kilometers of territory. This does not include Nizhny Klin because we don't have proof of it yet, but it does include all of the open fields that are between the Snagost River and Tolstoy Lug, for instance. So that's important to mention. South of Zeleny Shlai, you do actually have a Russian advance now, substantial Russian gain. Looking at this furthest extended amounts to about 3 kilometers southwards. This is important because, again, you're looking at a Russian sort of salient that was formed several months ago now between Zeleny and Novoivanovka that is very, very narrow in nature, and then it makes it difficult to move in supplies and to try to broaden the offensive activities. And it also creates opportunities for the Ukrainians to fire upon the Russians from the flanks, from the north especially, and also from the south. And the Ukrainians have displayed that they have the ability to conduct localized counterattacks in this region due to the amount of offensive forces that were organized in August for the Kursk region in the first place. So the Russians can't take it for granted that they're always going to hold on to every single square inch of territory that they get control over in these areas. But now, due to the capture of this yellow polygon, this 7.6 square kilometer area, it really does expand the zone of operation southwards along a key highway, and that makes it difficult for flanking operations that the Ukrainians may have tried to embark upon had the Russians just sort of stayed in these two villages here and not expanded southwards. As a result of the Russian expansion, they were able to take over full control of these warehouses that are just south of Zeleny and also reach some of the tree lines and just more generally advance along a key road. When it comes to the most important thing captured by the Russian side, it would be part, but not the entirety, of this localized stronghold that was originally built by the Russians and then taken over by the Ukrainians. I do want to look at the geolocations and see which one is more recent, because there's this area really has been an epicenter of fighting, both during the August period when the Ukrainians overran it, and also during the October period when the Russians first reached this area and then were pushed back. So here you can see two Russian vehicles dismounting infantry after they advanced along this Verdlikovo road, and dismounted troops. Again, near this localized stronghold, troops dismounted and then began fighting, engaging in a close quarters combat with the Ukrainian side. There's a few other videos from this region. This one is interesting. It's from the 38th Marine Brigade, I believe, or 36th Marine Brigade, sorry, in this case, where they had two Marines located in one of the trenches. They held off against a dozen Russian soldiers that were trying to advance through an open field into the trench itself. And they did so both with small arms fire. So they fired from their defensive positions out into the open as the Russians were advancing towards them, but also did so with artillery support, striking those Russian soldiers. So probably the front line is around this region, with the Russians trying to now send in infantry to clear out the remaining strong points here, but now finally having this foothold that will allow them to expand southwards along this Verdlikovo highway to reach Verdlikovo itself. Right now, this Verdlikovo, if you're looking at it, is the conduit between the border of Sumy and Kursk, and then also the broader Kursk salient that the Ukrainians have control over. It's only about 3.4 kilometers away from the front line right now. And again, serves as a conduit between, let's say, the Nikolaevka, Darino, Nizhny Klin area, and previously also areas that are closer to Kuranovo and Suja itself. So it is a very, very important town that also protects physically the road that leads into Suja. And that could be another threat if the Russians continue to advance along this road. And so definitely something to keep an eye out for, as this has now become one of the largest Russian advances in this region over the past couple of weeks. But of course, this comes with a cost, as the Ukrainian garrisons over here are very, very strong, including the 225th Assault Battalion and the 36th Marine Brigade. So in Zeleny Shlach itself, before the Russians were able to even launch an offensive southwards, the Ukrainians posted footage showing a destroyed BMD, BTR-82A destroyed, MTLB destroyed, and also a Buran combat vehicle that was destroyed by the Ukraine side. And finally, I want to just briefly mention the fact that Zelensky has now appointed a new commander for the armed forces of Ukraine's ground forces. His name is Mikhailo Drapati. So he is 42 years old. He's interesting because he's served in the Ukrainian military for over 10 years now, involved in the original 2014 battles in Mariupol. And during the entire pre 2022 conflict era. He just served as a brigade commander in various units like the 38th or 72nd Brigade. So definitely did build up a lot of experience on the ground with individual soldiers during that time period. And that is something that's absolutely critical for Ukrainian command going forward. Zelensky has also said that himself, that he wants just higher ups to have a more deep and relatable connection with the actual soldiers that are fighting on the ground, that actually are fighting in the trenches. And so Mikhailo Drapati, he is known for his very good organizational skills. Ever since I believe it was May of this year, he served as the head of the Kharkiv strategic grouping that was tasked and formed at the time with defending against the Russian offensive in Lipsy and Volchansk. And if you guys are aware of the fighting over here, you'll understand that initially there was a lot of fear due to some of the mismanagement of the trenches built over here by the Ukrainian side and a lack of troops that were manning the broader front. But ever since the appointment of Drapati in this case to defend against the Russian offensive in this entire sector, there really has been a stabilization that has allowed the Ukrainians to continue operating in Vovchansk, not just in the city itself, but also in the northern part of the city, despite the fact that there are very numerous and very strong Russian assaults over several months. And then same thing over here in Hliboke, allowing the Russians or preventing the Russians from reaching Lipsy itself, and then further capitalizing on those advances. And at the same time, the Ukrainians were able to conduct their own localized counterattacks to improve, their positions in these regions. So definitely did a good job with this location, given the circumstances that he was facing. And then he was also in charge starting September of 2024 as the head of the Luhansk strategic grouping. And so then he would have probably been involved with defensive activities around Seversk and more generally along the Terny region. And so Ukrainian sources locally, they report that he did a pretty good job ever since September up until today with that role. And so it is understandable why Zelensky is now, putting him up in that position as commander of the ground forces, because of his good organizational skills, good connection with the soldiers. He's relatively young. And Zelensky himself has said that he wants to sort of cut down on the bureaucracy in the armed forces of Ukraine. And we're going to get to that more in a second. And probably, with this pick, Drapati, he's sort of emblematic of that entire feeling within the new generation of Ukrainian generals, I'd say. Then his deputy, Drapati's deputy that has now been appointed, is Oleg Apostol, and he's 37 years old. He's the commander of the 95th Air Assault Brigade. If you guys know the history of the units, recently they've been involved in defensive activities in Toretsk itself. And during the time period where it was actually active in Toretsk, because it's not there anymore, the 95th Brigade really was critical in ensuring that the Russians did not achieve a quick breakthrough past the suburbs into the city itself. A lot of the Russian gains that have been occurring recently have occurred ever since the 95th Brigade left, and some of the units that have really been sent in its stead have not lived up to the same expectations. And so the 95th Brigade clearly did something right during its defensive activities in this region. Probably some of it has to do with just the manpower itself, not just leadership, because some of the manpower was more experienced. It's an air assault units, receives more specialized equipment and training. So you can't really put that all on a single man. That's the commander. It's just sort of the infrastructure built around the unit itself. But then also around Kursk, the 95th Brigade was involved in some of the most important initial breakthroughs starting in August of 2024, and ever since has been involved in the defensive activities and localized counterattacks that the Ukrainians are conducting in Kursk on a day-to-day basis. So it's also understood that he did a pretty good job with the 95th Brigade, given everything else that's going on in the circumstances surrounding Kursk. So he also did a good job with them over here. So it's also understandable why Zelensky would pick him. But I just find it interesting that there isn't any representation of the units that are currently fighting in the regions that are most affected by it, not necessarily peripheral fronts, but the areas that are at the forefront of key Russian advances, areas that need to be defended most, which would be the Donbass region. It would be the region starting from Velyka Novosilka all the way up northwards to, say, I don't know, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk. Simply, we're not seeing promotions for sort of commanders that are defending in these regions sometimes not receiving all the munitions or receiving all the manpower they need at their behest, but are still doing their best to hold on to certain locations. So we didn't see any of the local commanders from those units being promoted to higher roles, even though they may have deeper knowledge about how to organize the broader Ukrainian military, not just a specific brigade, into a defensive structure that could allow them to hold out in this entire sector of southern Donetsk. So I just found it interesting that Zelensky did not choose anybody from that ilk of the Ukrainian brigades that were defending in this particular region, and chose two commanders that are fighting right now, either in Luhansk or Kharkiv or Kursk, which is sort of more peripheral to the main parts of the front line where the Russians are achieving the most advances. But in any case, we also have reporting from the Ukrainian side that they're looking by the end of November, and we'll see if that actually happens because we're pretty close to the end of November, to sort of transition the Ukrainian military structure away from its current brigade basis into a brigade corps basis, because right now what you have are a lot of brigades that are, of course, temporary in nature. That's the way they were built initially in 2022. Just temporary units that were supposed to facilitate men that could fight in combat, and not necessarily long-term ecosystems that could exist on their own. So now it's come the time to sort of work together with have all these Ukrainian brigades put together into a singular structure with a streamlined command and control center and communication equipment that could be dispersed into various locations accordingly. And so just sort of like a streamlined process without a lot of bureaucracy, and with a deep understanding between the officers and their subordinates, and communication from unit to units. Because right now the level above brigade that the Ukrainians have is a tactical group, and those tactical groups, they have between 7 to 8 brigades. That's simply too much. And when you look at it in reality, in practice, those tactical groupings do not stay united throughout the entire course of a certain period of time, because you have always decisions from higher ups to rotate troops from one area to another, from the rear to one front, etc. And so it's not really tactical grouping if half the units within the 7 to 8 brigades are on another part of the front line. And so then what's the point of having the same staff for the entire grouping? And then it becomes very redundant. So it's better, according to the Ukrainian interpretation, to base the Ukrainian military structure off of these sort of brigade corps, which would be the size of around 4 to 7 brigades, or something around that number. And so these ones would work together in tandem in a certain location, have a streamlined officer corps, and they would, again, not necessarily be rotated out all the time to different parts of the front line. They just have to be within the same sort of location, and that would improve the efficiency of the entire body. And this is instead of having a division based unit system, which would be around 4 brigades, because probably the Ukrainians assume that it is too small of a structure that they're aiming for, to only have 4 brigades within each sort of like division. So that's one thing. And then also, they don't want to have a division structure and then also have a corps structure, because then you have to have 2 sets of officers, 2 sets of commanders for each layer of organizational bureaucracy. And Zelensky said that he wants to cut it as much as possible, and so he's only focusing on one layer of organization for brigades that is like higher than just the brigade itself, and that would be the core structure, which is currently in practice, because right now it's currently being discussed. And Zelensky said that if Syrskyi and the Ukrainian military, desires that, then he'll be in favor of it. But in any case, what right now the Ukrainians have 3 army corps, the 9th, 10th, and 11th, and they are not unified at all. They have to be unified in this case, and in order to make the operation effective. And then there's also massive issues with staffing the officer corps, especially as the Ukrainians create dozens of new brigades all the time. And then that means that there needs to be proper commanders and officers, and NCOs, whatever it may be, that are staffing within those units. And so then they create just like a massive inflationary cycle, where people that aren't qualified are getting appointed to those positions, or maybe not at all. And so then it's redundant to create new brigades. But then you also have, besides the 3 army corps that have been created and haven't really been active recently, you have an army corps, 7th Army Corps within the Air Assault Force, and the 30th Army Corps within the Marine Brigade Force. So that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.